They still whisper about that summer in Rin Mesa, when the sun turned red too early, and the wind carried voices it didn't belong to. Most folks around those parts don't speak of curses anymore, not out of disbelief, but out of fear they might come true again. Back then, you couldn't find a colder heart than Sheriff Dunn's, or a more suspicious crowd than the folk hiding behind him. And when they tied that woman to the post outside town, even the desert held its breath. She was just a silhouette when they brought her in, covered in dust, hands bound with barbed rope. Her dress, once sky blue, was tattered like a ghost's flag, hair wild, lips cracked, and yet she didn't cry out, not even once. The townsfolk didn't call her by name. They just muttered, "Her." Then, under their breath, "The cursed one." They left her there as the sun climbed. No food, no water, just the dry breath of the canyon and a wooden stake in the sand. Even the dogs wouldn't go near her. A few children tried to sneak closer, curious as crows, but their mothers pulled them back with pale faces and harsh whispers. "She brings ruin," they said. She was the last soul seen at Calder Ranch before it burned. Every man who's looked in her eyes has wound up 6 feet down. The stories multiplied like flies, each darker than the last, and with no one to stop them, they grew roots. Sheriff Dunn spat in the dirt and adjusted his badge as if it meant something. "Ain't my job to judge," he muttered, standing on the porch of the general store. "But if the town votes to leave her to the wind, I ain't fighting her." So there she stayed. For hours, flies gathered at her brow. The heat baked her skin to copper. Still she stood, head low, breath shallow, tied to a post like a warning sign. No one asked where she'd come from. No one asked why she'd been spared if she truly brought death. In Rin Mesa, silence was easier than truth. By late afternoon, thunderheads curled over the far mesas, bringing with them a wind that stirred more than just dust. A storm was coming. Old folks felt it in their bones. But no one moved. No one offered her shelter. Whatever storm came, it would claim her, and the town would claim innocence. But as the first gust swept through the canyon, lifting grit and sand in stinging spirals, a sound rose above the wind. Hoofbeats, slow and deliberate, like they belonged to a man who feared nothing and knew time better than most. Out of the dust rode a figure, tall in the saddle, shoulders broad, wrapped in a dark duster that flapped like raven wings. His horse was ash-gray, with old scars down its flank. Rider and beast alike looked like they'd come from some place long buried. He said nothing as he approached the post, just reined in, dismounted, and walked straight to her. The townsfolk watched from windows and doorways, breaths held. Some prayed. Others readied their rifles, though none dared raise them. The woman looked up for the first time. Her eyes were dry, not pleading, not afraid, just tired. The man took one look at her wrists, then at the knot in the rope. With a blade worn thin from use, he cut her free. Someone, maybe the blacksmith, shouted, "You don't know what you're doing, stranger. That woman's cursed." The man turned slowly. His face was half shadowed by the brim of his hat, but the set of his jaw, the scar crossing his cheek, said plenty. He looked over the crowd like a man counting ghosts. "She's mine now," he said. No one answered. No one moved. Even Sheriff Dunn shifted back a step. The stranger lifted the woman into his saddle. She swayed once, gripping the horn, and settled behind him like she belonged nowhere else. Her eyes didn't meet the townsfolk again. She watched the horizon. The man swung up beside her, nodded once to no one in particular, then turned his horse and rode back into the rising storm. The dust swallowed them in moments, and when the wind calmed and the last of the hoofbeats faded, Rin Mesa was left with something colder than fear, questions. Who was he? Where had he come from? And why, of all people, would he claim a curse? But the desert isn't generous with answers. It only echoes the names we dare not say. And that day, the only name spoken aloud was whispered by a child peering out from behind her mother's skirt. Is he a hero? The wind didn't answer. It just carried the question east, where the sun was already dying behind blood-colored cliffs. The wind had quieted, but the silence that followed was heavier than any storm. The stranger and the woman, dust-covered and mute, disappeared into the horizon like phantoms carried on hooves. And Rin Mesa, a town built on silence, stayed true to itself. Doors locked, voices hushed, and eyes lowered. Miles from the settlement, beneath a low ridge of burnt orange stone, the stranger pulled his horse to a stop. The woman slumped forward, her body heavy with dehydration, but she did not fall. Her fingers, cracked and dirt-crusted, still gripped the saddle horn with the strength of someone who had been alone too long to let go. "We'll stop here," he said, his voice low, sanded by time and wind. She didn't answer, just slid off the saddle and collapsed into the dust. He moved with quiet efficiency, unrolling a bedroll, kindling a fire, boiling water in a blackened tin pot. He never looked at her as he worked. He didn't have to. She watched him with the cautious stillness of a cornered animal. He finally handed her a dented cup of water. She drank in slow sips, her eyes on his. "Name's Elias," he said, voice like dry gravel. "Elias Boone." Her voice, when it came, was hoarse but deliberate. "You shouldn't have taken me. Didn't seem like you had many options." She looked down at the rope burns, circling her wrists. "You don't know what I am." Elias shifted, tossing another piece of mesquite into the fire. "No," he said, "but I know what they think you are. And I've seen what fear makes good people do." She snorted. "They're not good people. Not when it counts." Elias studied her for a long moment. She didn't flinch. "I never asked your name." "You didn't have to," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "It's already a curse." He didn't press. Instead, he opened his saddlebag and pulled out a piece of jerky, tossing it toward her. She caught it, tore it with her teeth, and chewed like someone who didn't trust the luxury of food. "You got folks after you?" She stopped chewing. "Yes. Law. Worse." Elias nodded once, as if that was answer enough. The canyon deepened in darkness around them, stars spilling across the sky in cold, in different clusters. Coyotes called from somewhere behind the hills, but neither Elias nor the woman stirred. The fire cracked softly, its light painting them in flickering gold. "Why'd you do it?" she asked finally. "Why take me?" He didn't speak for a long time. "I've seen too many folks die tied to things they didn't deserve," he said at last. "Figured I'd sleep better knowing I cut one of 'em loose." She stared at the fire, her jaw tight. "You won't sleep better." "I never said I sleep." Silence returned, but it wasn't empty. There was something building in it, thicker than suspicion, quieter than trust. In the morning, the sun crested the ridge like a slow blade. Elias woke before first light, checked his rifle, and let the coals die. The woman sat up without prompting, already alert, as if her body no longer remembered what rest was. They rode east through the narrow canyons, where the sandstone walls whispered to each other in echoes. She didn't speak, but Elias caught her scanning the ridgelines, eyes sharp, calculating. Not fearful. Preparing. "You expecting them soon?" he asked. She nodded. "They won't stop. Not until I'm dead." "Who are they?" She hesitated, then said, "They call themselves the Briar Sons. Outlaws. Raiders. Liars." He glanced at her. "You crossed them." "Not on purpose." Her hands tightened on the reins. "I survived something they wanted buried." Elias didn't ask what. He didn't have to. He'd heard of the Briar Sons, old gang from Red Hollow, known for leaving behind burned towns and headless lawmen. Their leader, Harlan Pike, was said to carry a Bible in one hand and a branding iron in the other. "You saw something," Elias said. "Something they don't want told. They think if they kill me, they erase it." He gave her a sidelong look. "Maybe they're wrong." "Maybe," she said, though she didn't sound convinced. By noon, they reached a bluff overlooking a dry wash. It was a narrow path, hemmed in by thorn brush and the twisted skeletons of mesquite trees. A good place to rest. A bad place to be followed. Elias dismounted. "We'll camp here tonight." She followed without comment, though her eyes lingered on the horizon. He could see her pulse beating in her neck, fast and steady. She was bracing for something. Elias had felt that before. The quiet before violence, the deep breath before the shot. "Delilah," she said suddenly. He turned. "My name," she said. "It's Delilah Gray." He nodded. "Thank you." Don't thank me yet, she muttered. The shadows grew long. They shared beans and stale biscuits. Elias kept his rifle close, his back to the stone. Delilah stayed near the horses, one hand always near the holster she'd refused at first, but now wore at her hip. As the light faded, Elias heard it. Hoofbeats. Distant, careful. Measured. Delilah heard them too. She was already crouched low, eyes toward the wash. Riders, Elias said. She nodded. 3. Maybe 4. He tilted his head. How do you know? They always travel in pairs. Moments later, 4 dark figures appeared along the ridge, scarves over their faces, guns slung low, lanterns glowing dim orange. One of them raised a hand in greeting, but it was mockery, not respect. Elias stepped forward, rifle low but ready. You lost, he called out. A voice came back. We're looking for someone. Girl. Brown hair. Brings fire and ruin. Delilah stood behind Elias, shoulders squared. Why don't you ride on? Elias said. And leave your fairy tales to the coyotes. Another voice laughed. She's got no fairy in her. Just hell. We'll take her now, the first voice said. Or burn you both come sunrise. The riders turned without waiting for reply, disappearing into the gloom like smoke. Elias looked at Delilah. Her face was calm, but her hands trembled slightly. They won't stop, she said. They'll come at dawn. Elias nodded. Then we dig in. He handed her a shovel, then took one himself, and began carving shallow pits near the bluff edge. Cover, not graves. Delilah hesitated, then joined him. As the stars sharpened overhead and the fire burned low, Elias glanced at her again. Why me? He asked. Why now? She looked up from the dirt. Because the story ends differently with you in it. The morning came like a hammer. Pale streaks of dawn cut across the canyon, casting long blue shadows. The air was still, heavy with anticipation. A hush clung to the stone walls, the kind that settled in moments before a storm or a gunfight. Elias was already awake, crouched behind the low bluff where they'd made camp. His rifle lay steady across a pile of brush, the barrel trained on the narrow pass leading into the wash. Delilah knelt beside him, her breath measured, her hands wrapped in leather gloves to hide the tremble beneath. They'll come from the south, she said. It's the only way down without breaking a horse's legs. Elias nodded. Let's hope they're impatient. She smirked, barely, and ducked lower. Then the silence broke. First came the scent of sweat and saddle oil, carried on the wind. Then hoofbeats, rhythmic, controlled. Not charging, not creeping. A confident approach. For riders emerged from the bluff trail. Dust clung to their coats like a second skin. They wore mismatched hats and bone-colored bandanas over their faces. The leader, broad-chested and straight-backed, rode a blood-bay stallion and carried a long-barreled rifle across his lap, like it was part of him. Elias recognized him immediately. Harlan Pike, he muttered. Delilah stiffened. You know him. Everyone west of Amarillo knows him. Preacher once. Turned bad after the war. Real fond of branding what doesn't obey. As if on cue, Pike raised a hand and signaled the others to halt. He dismounted slowly, each movement deliberate. Then he took off his hat and spoke to the air. Delilah Gray. His voice rang out smooth, like Sunday sermon. You've run long enough. Delilah stood up behind the bluff, fully visible now. You planning to kill me or baptize me, Harlan? The outlaw smiled without humor. You always had a sharp tongue. That won't save you. She leaned against the rock. Neither will your preacher act. We both know what you are. Truth cuts both ways, girl. You could have died quiet, back in Ren Mesa. Would have been cleaner. Now you've got a man involved. Elias rose beside her, rifle resting on the ledge. Don't much care for how you introduce yourself, Pike. Pike's eyes narrowed. Well now, that wouldn't be Elias Boone, would it? The Union scout who vanished after the Devil's Thumb ambush. Elias didn't blink. I've been busy. Pike tilted his head. Didn't think you were the type to bleed for strangers. She's not a stranger, Elias said. She's the only one telling the truth. That seemed to amuse Pike. He chuckled, low and slow. Well then, I guess you're both liars. He nodded to his men. They dismounted, rifles ready. They didn't shout. They didn't charge. The Briar Sons moved with the silence of men who'd done this before. Delilah slipped back behind the rocks. Her voice was tight. We don't have time to wait them out. Elias checked his sights. Then we don't. The first shot rang out. Elias, striking one of the riders in the shoulder. The outlaw dropped behind cover, howling. The others scattered, using brush and stone as shield. Bullets clipped the edge of the bluff, sending chips of rock into the air. Delilah returned fire, hitting a horse, forcing another rider to ground. But the numbers were against them. They'll try to circle us, she shouted. Elias glanced at the ridge line. Sure enough, one of the Briar Sons had flanked high, crawling along the edge with a carbine. Elias stood, fired once, clean through the man's chest. The outlaw toppled in silence. The canyon echoed with shots and smoke. The sun crept higher, casting sharp light through the dust. Sweat rolled down Elias's temple. His jaw clenched. Ammunition was low. He looked at Delilah. Her face was streaked with soot, but her eyes burned clear. You still got the thing they want? He asked. She reached into her coat and pulled out a thin ledger, leather-bound and dirt-stained. Ledgers don't usually start wars, Elias muttered. This one does, she said. Names, payments, deputies, judges, Pike's whole network. I took it from his camp after they burned Calder Ranch. Elias stared at it. You're not cursed. You're the witness. Delilah nodded. That's why they want me gone. Not because of who I am, but because of what I remember. A sudden cry rang out. Another rider hit. Elias ducked and reloaded. Only two left now. Then Pike stood tall in the center of the wash, unarmed, hat in hand. Delilah, he called out, I'll make you a deal. She rose slowly, rifle aimed. You hand over that ledger. I let you and the boy walk. Cross my heart. Like you let the Calder family walk, she shot back. He smiled. They weren't as useful as you. Delilah took a breath. Then she threw the ledger into the dust at his feet. Pike blinked. Then a shot cracked through the canyon. It was Elias. His bullet struck the ground beside Pike's boot on purpose. A warning. Pike bent to pick up the ledger. And that was when Delilah moved. She rolled over the bluff edge, rifle raised. Pike spun, startled, but too late. Her shot hit him square in the chest. He staggered, eyes wide, then collapsed beside the ledger he'd killed so many to protect. The final Briar Son dropped his rifle and ran. Silence returned, thick and final. Delilah stood over Pike's body. The ledger lay beside him, pages fluttering in the breeze like ghost stories. Elias stepped up beside her. You all right? She looked at him. No, but I'm still breathing. They stood there for a long moment, the canyon around them holding its breath. And though the sun had risen, it felt like night had finally ended. The canyon didn't forget easily. Its stones were old and patient. They held memories in their cracks, gunfire, hooves, whispers that had turned into legends. And now, with the bodies cooling in the sand and the smoke drifting upward in lazy coils, the canyon watched Elias and Delilah in silence. They buried the dead quickly. The sun rose higher, burning away the morning chill. Flies had already begun to circle, buzzing like tiny funeral choirs. Delilah stood over Harlan Pike's grave longer than the rest. She didn't speak, didn't cross herself, just looked down at the mound of dirt and said quietly, You tried to make me your ghost. Elias gave her space. He understood the weight of being haunted. By noon, the two were riding again, winding north through the long red corridors of the Mesa lands. Their destination wasn't spoken. It didn't need to be. Justice rarely had an address, but they were headed toward it all the same. Delilah clutched the ledger like a second heart. Each name inked inside it was a stone in a trail. She'd been walking blind. Deputies, judges, ranch barons, hired guns. Every one of them had played their part in the Briar Sons' quiet empire. Where do we take it? She asked. Elias didn't answer right away. The wind made words feel too heavy. People need to see it, he said finally. Not just one town. All of them. Take it to Larkspur. That judge there, Rebecca Hollis, She's hard and honest. She'll read it out loud in the courthouse." "You sure?" Delilah asked. "No," Elias said, "but that's where we start." They rode in silence for hours, the rhythm of hoofbeats filling the quiet between them. At a narrow stretch of trail, they passed beneath a ridge of carved stone that bent overhead like the throat of a cathedral. The place had a name on old maps. Widow's Arch travelers once believed it echoed the last words of the dead. Delilah slowed her horse and looked up. "My father died in a place like this," she said, "long before Pi came." Elias waited, saying nothing. "They called it a landslide," she went on. "Said the canyon collapsed on him and 3 other miners. But my mother, she swore she heard the rock speak that day. Said they weren't natural sounds." "What did she mean?" Delilah's lips pressed tight. "She meant someone made them fall. Meant it wasn't the earth's fault." Elias nodded slowly. "And you believe her?" "I do now." Farther down the canyon, they stopped to water the horses at a narrow creek. Delilah knelt and washed her face, letting the cool rush soak through the fatigue in her bones. "Elias," she said, voice low, "why'd you disappear after the war?" He sat on a smooth stone nearby, fingers idly turning a spent cartridge between them. "Because I killed a man I wasn't supposed to." Delilah stilled. "He wore the wrong coat," Elias said. "Blue like mine. Rode in ahead of his unit to ask for help. I didn't wait. Shot him through the heart. He didn't look at her. I stayed behind after that. Couldn't ride with the others. Couldn't ride with the guilt. So I became someone else." Delilah stood, drying her hands on her coat. "Sounds like you made a life of listening to the quiet." He glanced at her. "Sometimes the quiet tells more truth than people do." They rode again at dusk, silhouettes against the copper sky. The air smelled of sage and wind-blown dust. Somewhere in the distance, thunder murmured, a promise or a warning. Neither of them could tell. By the time they reached the outskirts of a settlement, dry shacks huddled against each other like secrets. They were shadows themselves, cloaked in dusk and long hours. "This isn't Larkspur," Delilah said, squinting. "Too small." Elias pulled up his horse. "It's called Hensley's Crossing. One way in, no way out if trouble finds you." A boy no older than 10 stepped out from behind a wagon, holding a rusty shotgun in both hands. "You two look like trouble," he said. Delilah smiled. "Only to the ones who deserve it." The boy lowered the barrel a bit. "Then you might just be the first decent people we've seen in months." An older woman appeared behind him, wiping flour from her hands, her expression wary. Others trickled out from their homes, thin men, tired mothers, sunburnt faces, all wearing the same mask of suspicion. "What happened here?" Elias asked. A rancher spoke up. "Marshall ran off 2 weeks ago. Said the law wasn't worth dying for. Briar's son's been prowling since. Took supplies. Horse is my sister." Delilah looked down at the ledger. "Then they'll come back," she said. The crowd murmured uneasy. Elias turned to her. "We have the names. We can keep riding." She met his gaze. "And what happens to them when we leave?" He didn't answer, because she already had. That night they stayed. Delilah handed the ledger to the oldest man in town, a schoolteacher with milky eyes who used to read proclamations on courthouse steps. He took it with trembling fingers. "Let them all hear it," she said. By lantern light, he read each name aloud in the square. Each syllable was a chisel against the wall of fear the town had built around itself. Faces stiffened. Some wept. One man threw his hat to the ground in shame, his cousin's name listed among the betrayers. Elias stood in the back, rifle in hand, watching every shadow. But none moved. Afterward, the townsfolk brought out coffee, crusts of bread, dried apples. The firelight warmed the air, and the wind carried their voices across the canyon rim. And that night, the canyon whispered back, not in fear, but in the small, unshakable murmur of a place learning to speak the truth again. Dawn cracked like flint on steel. The wind shifted just after sunup, carrying with it the sound of riders, hooves pounding hard, fast, and without disguise. Dust rose from the southern trail, twisting in long, angry spirals. Delilah stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse, rifle balanced across her arms. Her coat flapped behind her like a weathered flag. Elias stood a few feet away, sharpening the edge of a Bowie knife with calm precision. The fire in the square had long since died down, but the embers still glowed. "They're not hiding, they're coming," she said. "No reason to," Elias replied. "They think this place is still afraid." He looked out toward the horizon. 6 riders, fast, heavily armed. One flew a torn black kerchief tied to the barrel of his carbine, a symbol once feared up and down the frontier. The Briar Sons hadn't been wiped out in the canyon, only thinned, and what was coming now wasn't revenge. It was erasure. "They'll want the ledger," Elias said. Delilah nodded. "We don't give it to them." Behind them, the townsfolk were stirring. Faces creased with fear peeked through half-shuttered windows. A few clutched old rifles. Most clutched prayers. Elias turned to them, voice steady. "They're coming for what you heard. That's how you know it mattered." The boy from the night before, still holding his rusted shotgun like it weighed more than his spine, stepped up. "Then we'll make sure they don't take it." Something shifted then. Not in the air, but in the people. They stood straighter, stepped forward, took their places. Some at windows, some on rooftops. Not warriors, not outlaws. Just people tired of being quiet. The riders came hard into town, kicking up sand and menace. They pulled up fast, their horses frothing and snorting. The lead rider dismounted, a wiry man with a scar that split his lip in 2 directions. His eyes were dark and lazy, like he didn't much care who died as long as the dying kept things quiet. "You got something of ours," he said. Delilah stepped into the center of the street. "No, I've got something that was never yours to begin with." He looked her up and down, then laughed. "Heard about you. The cursed girl who can't die. That true?" Elias came up behind her. "You want to find out?" The rider's eyes flicked to Elias. Recognition dawned. "Boone," he muttered. "You should have stayed gone." "I tried," Elias said. "You people kept digging me up." Then the street fell still. It wasn't a fast fight. It was brutal, drawn out, messy. Gunshots tore the silence apart. Screaming led into wood and flesh. One of the townsfolk, old Emery, the blacksmith, was hit early, but he kept firing from the ground, teeth clenched. Delilah moved like fire, using corners and shadows. She dropped 2 of the riders, with clean shots to the chest. The third grazed her shoulder, but she didn't flinch. Pain was just another ghost to her now. Elias fought like a man, with nothing left to lose. His rifle barked thunder. His knife flashed silver. When the dust finally settled, 4 of the 6 riders lay dead. The last 2 fled into the brush, wounded and screaming. It was over, but the silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire. Delilah slumped against the water trough, blood painting her sleeve. Elias came to her, checking the wound. "Through and through," he said. "You'll be fine." She looked up at him. "You always this good with predictions?" He half smiled. "Only when they're needed." The townsfolk gathered, eyes wide, breath shallow. The boy stood beside his mother, staring at Delilah like she was made of myth. And maybe she was. Later that day, Judge Rebecca Hollis arrived from Larkspur, a woman in a gray riding coat and wire-rimmed spectacles. She rode with a deputy and a conviction that couldn't be bought. Elias handed her the ledger in silence. She didn't ask where it came from. She just opened it and began to read. By nightfall, every name in the book was public record. Writs were written. Warnings sent. The law, real law, moved in from Larkspur, clean and deliberate. The people of Hensley's Crossing rebuilt their fences, repaired their doors, but they didn't lower their voices anymore. Delilah stood at the edge of town, saddling her horse. Her shoulder was bandaged, her coat torn, but her spine was straight. "You could stay," Elias said. She shook her head. "I was tied to a post in Rin Mesa, left to die. I won't ever be tied again, not to places." He didn't argue. Instead, he handed her a thin notebook, the last blank pages of the ledger. "What's this?" she asked. "New names," he said. "Honest ones. Write them down. Start a different kind of list." Delilah nodded. "What about you?" she asked. Elias looked to the horizon. "I've got roads left to walk, but for the first time in a long time. I'm walking forward. She mounted her horse, tipped her hat, and rode east, into the morning, into whatever came next. Elias watched until she vanished behind the ridgeline. Then he turned and walked back into town. The dust had settled, but the names would rise.